If anyone wanted to ask a question or two right now, I'd be happy to try and deal with them.
Hi. Whilst I'm a person with a vision impairment, and I have a lot of friends who have disabilities of varying degrees. So whilst we appreciate that physical access is a big issue in using taxis, but the other key issue is communication. So for someone with a vision impairment, for instance, for myself, the issue is I can't see the ID number, I'm not sure, whether the fare being charged is accurate, all those sorts of things. But also people with cognitive disabilities have their own sets of issues, and the heading that it comes under is communication. Likewise, people who have other communication sort of concerns and considerations that have to be made. So I think we need to be thinking, yes, it's about physical access, but it's much broader than that.
Well, thank you. That's a very important and fundamental point. I appreciate you having raised that point, and I accept that has to be part of the agenda. It's probably not stressed that much in this paper, so we're glad to hear it. And it is true, there are some areas where a much greater effort is made to cater for the needs, for example, of the visually impaired. And then with the cognitive problems that you have mentioned, also this is a challenge right across a whole range of services provided by the private and the public sector, which in our society we tend not to handle very well.
Professor, thank you for coming and organising this for us. Mine is what I call the disabled working poor. We work 5 days a week, we pay tax, we don't collect a pension, we still only receive 50% subsidy for our taxi travel to and from work. What I was hoping to suggest was that our taxi travel to and from work should be raised to 75%, so it's at least affordable. In my case, I'm paying $500 a fortnight just to get myself to work. I'm actually cost effective because I save the government money in the tax that I pay and the pension that I do not collect, and you're behind the 8 ball. So I'm wondering, taxis are absolutely almost becoming unaffordable. Then if you've finally got to say, well, I can't even afford to get to work, it's absolutely tragic. And what is anybody doing about it?
Well, that's a very powerful point that you have made, and we'd be interested to hear more about it. But I just want to acknowledge that you, on those facts, you have a pretty important point.
Professor Fels, I'm Sally Staback and I've come down from Kyneton. We have a problem for people with disabilities in our town, and I cannot speak for other rural towns, obviously. We have considerable disability services in Kyneton, and the taxis, the disability, or taxis in general, but in particular the disability taxis, are taken up 4 hours a day transporting people to disability services or to school. That's 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night, so that anybody else, for example my neighbour who is elderly and disabled, can't get a taxi. 4 hours a day. If she wants to come down to town, because perhaps to come to this event, she would not have been able to get a taxi to get the train to get here on time or to get home. Doesn't seem reasonable. I understand the taxi owner's difficulty. He can't put on a fleet of taxis for disabled people that will most primarily sit idle, but it's a very real difficulty, and I think that there are a lot of these kind of things happen in rural areas. I'd also like to comment, having been to Europe last year, on the London cabs, where every taxi is able to take a disabled person. I was considerably impressed with it. I think that the vans and the, with the raised roofs, if anything, draw attention to the fact that people are disabled. I watch my neighbour being rolled up a ramp into the van, and I just think it's degrading when, if we had appropriately designed taxis, she could just go in off the footpath like everybody else does and be normal.
Well, again, these are two very important points you've made, and I want to underline the fact that our scope includes rural and regional Victoria, and the special problems, although they're not the ones you've mentioned, aren't that special to country towns, although maybe the first one is a particularly acute manifestation that does happen in country towns. Again, this is the sort of point that we want to hear about today.
I appreciate the point that they're making about the country, because that the regions do have problems that we in the city don't have, but the availability of taxis, that problem she mentioned, is a problem that we have all the time in the city, that the drivers are just not available until after 10:30 in the morning, and they're not available between 2 and 4 in the afternoon on school runs and that. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I think we need to appreciate that the problem that arises because you've got maxi cabs who can take a party of 11 individuals but can only take 1 or 2 wheelchairs. Now, frankly, knowing what the taxi drivers earn, if I were a taxi driver, I'd be a bit loath to take one disabled person rather than a party of 11. We've got to consider the economics all around, I think. And could I say I strongly support the concept of a centralised booking office, not only in Melbourne but in all of the regional areas, that must keep a record of all that has happened, and a centralised complaint service. Now, if it's written, if it's officially recorded what time you rang up and what the arrangements were, then you can find a record of exactly who's not measuring up. Thank you.
Well, they're three very important points. I think we just have to keep discussing these kinds of things during the day. I haven't got instant answers. We've got to you in the queue.
Good morning, Professor Fels, and thank you for being the person that is heading this inquiry, because many of us here trust you and your work. So thank you very much on that score. Actually, I have a document here, and you're quite welcome to receive it, in that this is, it was a media statement by the Minister for Public Transport, who has changed, I realise that, but this was Friday 25th of June 2010, in that it states that Melbourne taxi passengers, especially those with special needs, will soon benefit from more reliable and timely services, with the release of 530 taxi licences, including 330 wheelchair accessible taxis. Now, I don't think any one of us here have heard of any progress as to whether those licences have been taken up, and in what amount, because the more taxis we have, then we have the answer to the lady here, to the lady over there that spoke. It's not the answer, but it will contribute to the answer.
Yes, well, that was a very, at best, limited approach, and as you have implied, taken an awful long time to translate into reality at all. And you and the previous lady also get at a bit of a point that you sort of think about the taxi industry, and then you think, well, they're a bit of a problem for the industry in what to do at peak and off-peak times, and maybe there won't be quite enough cars to go around at peak. But the big losers clearly are the disability people. They get put to the bottom of the queue. I think that's what you're saying. And that does focus a bit on the question of having more taxis available generally. That seems to be quite an important issue. And also it's a system issue. What your two questions come from kind of specific concerns, but they make you start thinking about the interaction of all the different bits of the system. So we are, as part of this, trying to have an overall look at the system. And on one hand, that is relevant to the special problems for disability. And on the other hand, it's also, in our mind, very important that we don't come up with a system solution that happens to ignore the needs, probably the greatest needs in the community, which is this sector that is here today.
Good morning, it's Morris Gleeson speaking from Blind Sports Victoria, but however I'm not representing them today, I'm speaking as an individual. Professor and others, I think today is very exciting. I think it gives us some opportunity to hopefully, sadly, I think a lot of these issues we have been talking about for the last 30 years that I know of, they're quite systemic issues. I speak very highly of the overall taxi industry. A person with a sensory disability, I think many of the drivers are fantastic. However, there are a number who obviously lack of training or awareness or for whatever reason are not as helpful as they could be. So that's one issue. I think the other issue is not just the number of taxis. I understand it's really a struggle to get those taxi drivers. So it's, you can have 400 new taxis, but if we don't have the drivers to use them, I think that has been an issue. Because I'm leaving at lunchtime, I'm saying a couple of things now. In your workshop document, I think I read something like normal public transport system. Could we consider not to delete the word normal? It's a word that I personally don't like. I'm happy with regular public transport or traditional public transport. Just say normal, I struggle with that word. And the other thing is, I think even the taxi company themselves, one of the things I've noticed, you ring up and make a booking, then you wait, your taxi doesn't turn up, then you ring back, then I can't find that booking, the original booking that you put in. So that can be quite an issue from an operational point of view.
Well, thank you for those comments. About the normal public transport system, there is clearly a wider question about the role of taxis in a wider transport system. And whether there are greater opportunities for the taxi industry to play a bigger role in the whole public transport offering. I've always personally wondered, and I've now got a chance of looking into this, why can't there be a greater, more expanded role for taxis in a whole lot of fields, in the outer suburbs, late at night, special needs, people who just have to get to a doctor, whole variety of things which I just wonder if there isn't some way in which the industry could play a greater role than at present through providing some services that they don't at the moment and helping fill in some of the gaps in the whole public transport system. On the question of drivers, you are right, there are issues about their training in general, let alone in relation to disability. My own prejudices on the subject at the moment, my own experiences are that the majority of rides I've had in taxis have been quite okay, but the number of slightly unsatisfactory experiences, and I haven't got a disability, is more than it should be, and the occasional extremely unsatisfactory experience happens too often, and that is being picked up in surveys, and we're hearing similar views but more strongly. I'm sort of picking up quite a bit in the disability sector, and I take your point that I should be talking a bit wider than physical disability. I pick up sort of at one end, people are pretty happy because they know an individual who knows them and will do a pretty good and considerate job that takes account of their special circumstances. And then a fairly large number of other people who have quite a bad experience, who are not well catered for, not well looked after. It's kind of a bit bimodal.
Thank you. Most of the issues this morning are dealing on consumer issues. There's a couple of us here that are in the industry, and we believe as business owners the whole system could be improved, and we want to work for people with disabilities. However, it seems to be that quantity is the issue, and we believe it should be quality, and the service would run better if it was being monitored better by the Victorian Taxi Directorate. But unfortunately, that's the same organisation that trains the drivers and allows anyone to join. Secondly, when the 330 new licences were issued, isn't it true that 80 of them went to one organisation? And isn't it further true that many people in the industry were unable to apply because they hadn't driven taxis in the previous 5 years, even though they had operated commercial passenger vehicles? Why is it that commercial passenger vehicle operators owning hire car licences are not able to accept the taxi M40 cards? Why is it that we allow the Victorian Taxi Directorate not to answer any correspondence on any issue? They always cite privacy reasons as the reason why they can't handle your complaint. Therefore, I ask, as a comment, that the Victorian Taxi Directorate be disbanded completely, and that organisations set up that represents owners, drivers and consumers and allows all of us to work together to run a better industry.
Well, this question opens up another side to the discussion and the debate, and again indicates the breadth of the issues that come up, and that although we want to hear all about disability today, it does lead on to a range of wider questions about regulation, the regulatory system, the role of the Victorian Taxi Directorate, questions about the allocation of licences and so on. So I acknowledge that these are fair and reasonable questions to raise, and that the future of the regulatory system itself needs to be and is part of the inquiry. And that's also important because quite a few of the questions that come up with this audience and with others point to specific needs that need to be better addressed. And an underlying question is whether we could fix them with kind of more and better regulation. Let's pass over for a minute the quality questions you've raised. Let's say we've got some good regulators, are the best regulators in the world capable of managing a system that will deliver all of these diverse needs? Or is there any other approach that one can take, or some mixed approach to address a number of these interesting questions. Two more.
Professor Fels, my name is Peter Hibbert. I was seconded to the Taxi Directorate some years ago to look at a lot of the wheelchair taxi work. And I won't go through all of the things you've highlighted because we'll be here till next week. And none of them have changed in that period of time. In fact, I wrote a report that's got exactly all of those points and doesn't seem to have been enacted on a lot of it. However, there's a few, just 3 or 4 major points I'd like to point out. It was probably mentioned in somewhat there, the assignment system of the licences. How you are going to overcome that in the future, I don't know when they've already been assigned. And I think that's got a direct correlation with the quality of the drivers that we've got. If you've got 50, 60 licences assigned to you and you've assigned them to someone else, you haven't got control of the people further and further down the line, and I think that's a major problem we have within the taxi quality of service. A second one, and I think I noticed it, you touched on it in the Herald Sun fairly recently, is almost the monopoly of the charging system for people. There's only one major central company that runs the whole of the charging system. I think that's a terrible control to have over an industry, and something I don't know how you're going to break that, because they couldn't do it in Sydney when there was another taxi company started up. And I think Macquarie Bank fell on their sword trying to break that monopoly. I think also you touched on the booking system. I was constantly told there is no booking system because it had been tested in court that if a taxi company was held to be unable to uphold the booking, they would be could be sued for that. So they don't have a booking system. It merely is put out 20 minutes before the time you want it. So regardless of when you book, you've got no guarantee. And recently my brother-in-law, who has an intellectual disability and is visually impaired, we had a problem where the taxi didn't turn up. We rang up and were told, just because you book a taxi is not guaranteed that you're going to get one, and there is no booking system anyway. So that hasn't changed in that period of time. And I think also, I hear that the condemnation of the Taxi Directorate, but just remember, most of these taxis operate through a couple of major taxi organisations because of the dispatch system. And I think that there seems to be a need for control from that area also of the drivers. And a part of that goes with the booking system is the complaint system. There's never been satisfactory in what constitutes a complaint and how do you make those complaints become so difficult to do it. I would suggest that many people within this place today that have had bad experiences don't complain because it's just too difficult and feel that they haven't been listened to in the past. So until we can address some of those major issues, it's very difficult to move on to a lot of the others. And I don't know how you're going to do that with some of it, because there's a very powerful industry that you are facing at this point of time.
Well, I'm extraordinarily happy to be hearing about all of these issues. It informs me better. I'm extraordinarily distressed about the magnitude of the issues that have been raised by you and others in this discussion. Your questions bring out some of the competition issues that inevitably have to arise here. I have in mind competition, but I also have in mind don't go down that path and forget the disability sector. Don't go down the disability path if you're going to have a system that is not working very well in an underlying manner, because as a couple of the earlier questions have indicated, you might be on the receiving end, worst of a bad system. On the owner-driver issue, you kind of mentioned a point that comes up a lot in discussion, the divorce of ownership from driving. Now, I haven't thought this through, but I just wanted to make a couple of comments on it. One is that some people would go on and say, well, okay, clearly the answer is that we should have a system where the owner is the driver, something like that. And that perhaps resembles more what it used to be like in the old days. That's one way of doing it. Actually, when you think about it, there's some problems with that. you'd have 4,000 or 5,000 or more drivers to regulate in some fashion, because the industry does need regulation. So that's one way of thinking about it. But it has quite a few challenges as well as good features. Now, another model I've noticed in New Zealand is that they've gone down a slightly different path, and there is, and it's partly related to a booking point, but more general than that, there's a few competing businesses, and they have the big responsibility for the drivers and the performance. And so you take it a bit off the government and all the inherent weaknesses of regulation and put it into the hands of competing companies who are fairly desperate to get business, and as a result they pay huge attention to the quality of drivers. So that's another model. I certainly haven't made up my mind, but I just wanted to mention there's more than one way of thinking about how to skin this cat.
We have one last question, Allan.
John McKenna speaking as an individual. Professor Fels, I'm here because of your reputation. I think you've been acknowledged as a person who's made things happen. I'd like to ask a very direct question. What level of comfort do you have that the government is backing you and backing possible outcomes that might come out of today?
Well, all I know is that it was an early, high-profile announcement by the new government, and I guess they looked around for people who might do it, and they went for me, and I'm assisted by Dr. Cousins as Assistant Commissioner, who used to be the Director of Fair Trading and Consumer Affairs, former Chairman of the Prices Surveillance Authority, a member of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. So obviously, to my mind, and maybe to yours, maybe that's a sign that the government is pretty serious in its intent. Another aspect is that it is a long time since there's really been a thorough, deep look at the industry, and it is clear that some changes have to be made. I think that's clear to everyone. There's much more acceptance that something has to happen, and the level of public concern about the industry is far higher than it has been in the past. So I can't tell you what the government will do when we hand in the report, but I guess so far the signs are that they want something to happen.
Thank you for your honesty.